Hello friends, my name is JJ, and last week I made a video talking about the phenomenon of ordinary consumer objects from years past becoming the center of their own little nostalgia cults. The example I led with were these notebooks from Canada, which are an extremely nostalgic item for millennials and Gen Xers up here, because these were the notebooks that we used when we were in elementary school. There is a company in Winnipeg making guitar pedals done up to look like these books, which is the sort of thing you see when a nostalgic object is truly beloved. You know, people making and selling all sorts of knickknacks of it in order to capitalize on the sentimentality. Anyway, I asked you guys to give me some good examples of similarly sentimentalized nostalgic objects from your countries, and boy oh boy, did we get some fun ones. So join me, won't you, as we take a little tour of nostalgia triggering objects of the world. My friend FightyFish1779 starts us off with this interesting tale from Great Britain. In the UK, the Freddo chocolate bar is very sentimentalized. It's basically a very cheap frog-shaped bar of chocolate. You'll often hear older people say things like, "I remember when a Freddo was only 10p." And the fluctuating price of a Freddo bar is a common way to joke about the state of the UK economy and the cost of living. I looked into this, and he's right. The Brits even have this whole concept of Freddoflation as a sort of pseudo-scientific process of tracking just how things ain't what they used to be. In this 2016 Telegraph story, they published a little chart noting that the cost of Freddo bars has significantly outpaced the British rate of inflation, increasing over 4.5% per year. If Freddo prices continue to rise at a consistent rate, by 2030, one of them will set you back an eye-watering 38p, they note with considerable alarm. Food was by far the most common thing that you guys identified as being at the center of nostalgic cults in your countries. And more often than not, it wasn't even particularly good food, as this example from my friend from Ecuador illustrates. In Ecuador, we have some old-timey, disgusting sweet beverages called beba, a weird way of saying baby, that are basically jelly powder in water put into a soft, baby-shaped plastic bottle. I do not get how they were ever popular, but they still exist as a nostalgia trigger for boomers and Gen Xers. I recently found out that you can now buy Beba-themed merch, and I saw a Beba-shaped lamp at the local designer store. On that note, some of your examples of modern-day merchandise made to capitalize on the nostalgic memories of old products were pretty bizarre. For example, my friend Pierre informs me that a lot of children in France grew up using a brand of glue called Cleopatra, and apparently fondness for its distinctive smell is so strong that they now sell Cleopatra-inspired perfume, shower gel, and deodorant. Here is one from my friend Ryan from South Africa, a strangely specific one from South Africa, the pattern from a mattress. It was so ubiquitous that Googling South African mattress pattern brings it up in all of its 70s color-themed floral glory. It came back into fashion recently, being worn proudly on shirts, shorts, and possibly even underwear by Gen Xers and millennials, and perhaps to a lesser extent, their children. A similar example comes from my Swiss friend, Claudio, who tells me about a pattern associated with the popular Swiss supermarket chain Migros. Apparently, in the 90s, they introduced a line of low-cost products called Migros Budget that featured this distinctive green packaging. And now the pattern from that packaging is often used on ironic shirts and shoes and sunglasses and bedspreads. This is actually very reminiscent of something similar that we have in Canada. Our dominant supermarket chain, Loblaws, also introduced a line of budget products known as No Name that were very popular in the 90s, and you often see its distinctive yellow packaging style used in similarly whimsical contexts by nostalgic millennial types. Another supermarket-related example comes from my Danish friend, Ravenard. One thing that I can think of in Denmark is the poster with the Tobaksspigen, or the Tobacco Girl. This was an ad that came about in the 40s and 50s from a supermarket group known as FDB, which later became Coop. which is still a mainstay of the Danish consumer market today. So many people, even those who wouldn't have been alive at the time that these ads were around, hang these things on their wall as a minimalist aesthetic that fits really well with the general Nordic design of grayscale paint. Beyond that, it just reminds people of the post-war boom when the wider world and the consumer boons of life came to the average Danish household. That said, there have been debates on the passé nature of the ad, since it also calls back to an orientalizing viewpoint about Africans and other people of the global south. But for the most part, the debate has not really changed its popularity. The artist of this design, Age Sikker Hansen, was also responsible for other designs, such as a coffee one for the Circle Cafe. That's also a common poster. In my childhood home and in many Danish homes, we had both hanging up in our hallway. Now, obviously, the good old US&A, as the world's dominant producer of consumer goods, has produced no shortage of nostalgia-triggering things. Indeed, we could argue that much of the world's nostalgia these days is basically just nostalgia for American things, whether that's American cars, fashion, TV shows, music, or fast food. That said, the US has also produced a few consumer products that aren't that well known outside of the States, but are the subject of enormous sentimentality within the country. The object my American viewers brought up the most was this, the so-called Jazz Cup. This was a cheap style of paper cup that was extremely ubiquitous in the 1990s, seen in all sorts of places that were too stingy to use real cups, including the dentist's office, school cafeterias, outdoor parties, and the break room at your parents' office. Today, memories of these cups live on mostly in the form of ironic, kitschy objects done up in their distinctive pattern. But my favorite example of this particular nostalgia cult is the fact that the graphic designer who came up with the cup design back in the 90s was eventually tracked down by reporters who wanted to hear the full story behind this beloved American original. It was an unanticipated burst of fame for a woman who was clearly a little bemused that this was what her legacy was going to be.
I don't understand this.
These cartoon character face-shaped popsicles are another thing that a number of my American friends mentioned, usually Sonic or SpongeBob. I think anybody under the age of 40 grew up with these things in some form, and you see them parodied a lot in American culture these days. I remember this one guy did a performance art piece with this sort of popsicle done up in the shape of various American billionaires in order to let you literally eat the rich. The grotesqueness of these things is also fairly legendary, given how deformed the faces often get, not only as they melt, but often just due to sloppy construction at the old ice cream factory. Nickelodeon actually sold a set of plastic figurines of deformed SpongeBob popsicles, reflecting just how central this one weird aspect of them had become to their nostalgic appeal. Another great American example comes from my friend Rebecca, who, like many Americans, is half Latino and half white. And she says, for lots of young Latino kids, it's the empty Bustelo cans storing something totally different. And on my white side, the butter cookie tin storing sewing supplies. I actually bought a set of this type of cookies a while ago, not because I actually wanted to eat them, but because I knew I wanted to store my thumbtacks and rubber bands in this type of container. Other heavily sentimentalized American containers from decades past that you guys brought up include this pitcher with a suction lid, often used for frozen orange juice, this blue and white ceramic pot for casseroles, and using either Country Crock margarine tubs or Cool Whip containers for storing leftovers in the fridge. Speaking of kitchenware, my friend Vinny Scott Dude from Brazil says, most baby boomers in Brazil still have houses that are stuck in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of millennials and Gen Zers are nostalgic for this aesthetic. And based on what some of my other Brazilian viewers have said, this aesthetic inevitably includes a filtro de barro, or clay water filter, amber Duralex plates, this particular sort of ribbed cup known as a Lagoinha glass, and dishcloths featuring farm themes. Over in Spain, meanwhile, my friend Wetas Paddington cites a few kitchen things considered quite iconic to Spaniards of a certain age, including this can opener, this style of plastic chair, and this type of glassware, which comes in either orange or green. My friend says lots of people align into camps depending on whether theirs is green or orange. My family's is orange. My other Spanish friend informs me that a lot of millennial-aged Spaniards have a big cult of sentimentality around something called the EGB, which was the acronym used for the Spanish education system that was in place from the early 1970s to the early 1990s. Saying you are part of the EGB generation is apparently a popular shorthand in Spain for sharing a bundle of cultural experiences. And there is even a company called Yo Fui a EGB, I went to EGB, that makes cool books and board games based around reveling in EGB era memories. Talking of school, my Mexican friend Adriano tells me about this book, which he says is a very iconic Mexican grade school textbook, and there certainly seems to be a million memes and souvenirs made of it. Now, in the first video, I talked a bit about Ostalgie, which is the sentimentality that many people from the east of Germany feel towards the various consumer goods that were available back when East Germany was a separate country under a distinct communist government. A number of you guys from other parts of the former communist bloc noted that this kind of thing is quite popular in your countries too. My Polish friend Kazia2750 tells me about PRL nostalgia, which is the term for their communist government that lasted until 1989. In Poland, they have PRL-style bars, and every year they have a huge car show called this for collectors of the weird old cars from the communist era. A friend from Hungary says that old communist era cars are a source of considerable nostalgia in his country as well, and mentions some of the popular makes being Trabant, Wartburg, Lada, and the notorious Kisz Polski. A friend from Croatia, meanwhile, brings up the infamous Yugo, along with the Fico, which he says was the former Yugoslavia's answer to the Fiat 500. In addition to the cars themselves, people in these countries often buy and sell all sorts of collectible knickknacks relating to these old cars, like toys and prints and vintage ads. It's kind of an odd phenomenon in the sense that absolutely no one seems to believe that these cars were in any way functionally superior to the Western and Japanese cars that are sold today. So it's basically pure nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. My Russian viewers named a bunch of different nostalgia triggers for kids who grew up in the later years of the Soviet Union. But what I found most fascinating was my friend who told me about Russian video games. Apparently, Game & Watch style handheld LED games were quite popular in Russia in the late Soviet era, with the most popular of all being this egg-catching game, which stars a wolf and bunny from a popular Russian cartoon of the time. This game is the center of a huge cult of nostalgia in Russia, and it has been remade multiple times on modern systems, and it's the subject of endless parodies, including this one featuring Putin and pencils, which I do not quite understand. My Taiwanese friend, Joe Berge, says, here in Taiwan, peak nostalgia is a pair of blue and white slippers, a specific sort of plastic sandals that sell for around $2 US, paired with a gaji bag with its 3-colored stripes and handles. Both were lower middle class mainstays in the Japanese colonial and KMT authoritarian era, and now both have come full circle and are sold at expensive hipster shops in downtown Taipei. When I was searching for some images of these Taiwanese things, I came across this fun wallpaper pattern on Shutterstock. You can see that in addition to the slippers and bags, they have these old-fashioned scooter helmets on here, which I guess must be another very nostalgic object in that scooter-centric society. My other Taiwanese friend, Glass Yuzu, adds that these circular tin signs advertising that a store sells liquor and cigarettes are very heavily sentimentalized as well. He says it's funny because shops are still required to hang them nowadays, but they have a certain retro feel that everyone loves. Another theme that came up a lot in your examples were tales of public outrage whenever an iconic national brand tried to change something substantial about one of its most nostalgic products. My Belgian friend Stan tells me about the old style of branded Stella Artois beer glasses known as a Rebelke, which had a ribbed bottom, kind of like those iconic Brazilian glasses we talked about earlier. He says Stella discontinued them in favor of chalice-style glasses in order to give their beer a more exclusive allure for the international market. The new glasses look more like the glasses that specialty beers are served in, so I guess they figured the international audience would associate it with premium Belgian beers and be willing to pay premium prices for it. When they announced that decision 10 years ago, they were met with swift backlash from Belgians who loved the traditional glasses, but Stella never walked back on their decision, so now the old ones are highly coveted by enjoyers of the brand. Over in South America, my friend Adur1996 says, here in Uruguay, back in 2017, the biggest dairy company, Conaprole, made a big deal out of hosting an open call to redesign their line of chocolate milk cartons and do away with the outdated design that they had been using for decades. A design won the competition, made it to supermarket shelves, and a few months later, due to consumer backlash, was tossed away, and they went back to the tried and true design that is still being used to this day. It was such a nostalgic object, consumers refused to let it die. My German friend Martin, meanwhile, offers a very German version of this phenomenon. In Germany, we have a chocolate bar called Kinder Schokolade with a very unique design of a portrait of a little boy smiling. This face has changed multiple times over the past decades, with every generation having a certain child as their poster boy. More recently, however, there have been some promotional packages that use childhood pictures of German football players, thus creating controversy about changing the original design of a white, blonde boy, mainly on the political right. So in the previous video, I said that sentimentality around consumer goods is often driven in part by nostalgia for good economic times, which most countries experienced for several decades after World War II. Most countries, but not all. Obviously, some countries didn't develop an advanced consumer economy until quite recently. And what's interesting is that these countries sometimes try to skip a few steps and manufacture a cult of sentimentality around relatively modern products. My friend from Indonesia gives an example. Nostalgic merch isn't much of a trend here, probably because our country didn't have that much consumer spending until recently. But I've seen a similar trend of making current consumer products into merch, not driven by nostalgia, but more national pride and the fact that these consumer products are staples in our households. Merchandise that I often see are teh botol, jasmine tea, Indomie, instant noodles, and Bygone, anti-mosquito spray. Local artists will often illustrate these brands and make them into stickers and postcards and t-shirts and water bottles, though I don't know why anyone would find a water bottle in the design of toxic insect repellent appealing. Appealing or not, these bottles sure seem to be popular on Indonesian TikTok. So, hopefully you all enjoyed this little consumerist trip around the world. Longtime viewers will know that I'm pretty pro-consumerism in general, and a big reason why I take consumer goods so seriously is because they can provide such a revealing window into the lives of people different from ourselves and educate us about the culture that they actually experience. Culture is too often imagined as something pretentious or precious, something most ordinary people lack the capacity to create or appreciate. But sometimes culture is just a deformed popsicle, and that's okay. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next week.